Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the online event. Is it time to rationalize tax expenditures? My name is Sanjeev Gupta, and I'm a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. As developing countries recover from the pandemic, they will need to bring their public finances to more sustainable position. This is because at the peak of the pandemic, they expanded public programs to protect lives and jobs and gave tax concessions to promote economic activity. All these measures increase fiscal deficits and public debt. The war in Ukraine is further hitting the budgets with rising food and fuel prices. Rising interest rates in the US are likely to create further pressure on developing countries' fiscal position. So what this means is that going forward, developing countries would need to find avenues for raising more revenue. One area that holds potential is rationalization of tax expenditures. The question is, what are these? They are essentially tax breaks, exemptions, and incentives that governments provide to various sectors in the economy, ostensibly to promote employment, attract foreign investment, and to promote greening of the economy. They're kind of expenditures because governments forego revenues by granting concessions that are not part of the regular tax system. While tax expenditures can be an important tool for fiscal policy in pursuit of different policy goals, they are often opaque, costly, and ineffective, as well as politically motivated. These expenditures can be large and can amount to as much as 3% of GDP and up to 1/3 of total tax collections in developing countries. Two recent papers have studied this phenomenon in different parts of the world and present new evidence on how they are used and governed across developing countries. We are fortunate to have authors of these studies in the panel, and they will discuss their key findings. Before proceeding any further, let me take a few minutes to introduce today's sixth distinguished panelist. Catherine Bayer is a Deputy Director in the IMS Fiscal Affairs Department. Catherine works on issues concerning taxes and oversees capacity development services of the fund in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. She has worked in the US Treasury as well as in the Mexican tax administration. Catherine and I have been colleagues for many, many years. Louisa Dressler is an economist in the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the OECD's Center for Tax Policy and Administration. She has focused on environmental taxes and their interaction with investment policy. Tentetle Revel is head of the tax policy in Madagascar and has been working for over 15 years in tax policy and administration. Agustin Redonda is a senior fellow with the Council for Economic Policies. Agustin has also worked in the OECD as well as in the government of Argentina. Paulo Di Rencio is 2021-22 Policy Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Previously, Paulo worked as a Senior Research Fellow at the International Budget Partnership. Daniel Noor is currently head of Ghana's tax policy in the Ministry of Finance. He is involved in drafting of the exemptions bill currently awaiting passage by the Ghanaian government. For the audience, please note, send your questions via YouTube, Twitter at CGD, #CGD Talks, and email them at events@cgddev.org. These questions will be consolidated and sent to me, and then I'll pass them on to the panelists. So let me start with the first question for Paulo. What are the key takeaways for policymakers from the recent International Budget Partnership report on tax expenditures. Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sanjeev, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me just give you a very quick background on this paper and on this project, on the project that it is based on. We've been working, when I say we, I mean the International Budget Partnership, where I was working until last year when we carried out the research for this publication. We worked with 9 civil society groups in 9 Latin American countries, all of them around different topics related to tax expenditures. When we first started looking at tax expenditures as a big topic that these groups wanted to focus on in their analysis and their campaigns, we highlighted 3 issues that came up. One was the issue of transparency and access to information. The second one was the issue of governance and decision-making processes around tax expenditures. And the last one was the issue of impact and how effective tax expenditures are in achieving their policy objectives. And this publication is around the second topic. So we basically went out there and looked for evidence about how governments do or should approach decision-making around tax expenditures. And we found that there's actually very, very limited literature, very, very limited evidence. There is some guidance that international institutions came up with, mostly based on sort of anecdotal perceptions of what the issues are and what the problems are. And so we use those principles, which have been issued by organizations like the ones that are present here today, the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, and others. We took those principles and we asked the partners in the different countries to basically assess their countries based on these good practice principles. And what we found is basically 2 big, let's say, blocks of evidence. One is around the legal and regulatory framework for tax expenditures. And the second one is about the role of different actors and the role that different actors play in the decision-making process and the implementation of tax expenditures. So when it comes to laws and regulations, tax expenditures seem to exist in a sort of regulatory void, where basically there is no comprehensive, organic, legislative and regulatory framework that governments use to introduce, implement, and evaluate tax expenditures, which is usually the case with other budgetary items like taxation in general and spending. So we found that there was a very fragmented framework whereby some provisions were included in fiscal responsibility legislation, some of them in specific tax laws like the income tax law or the VAT law and so on. And some provisions were included in sectoral legislation, like legislation on investment, on tourism, on mining, on economic development, and so on. And this created a very fragmented framework where basically it is very difficult to pin down clear responsibilities and clear accountability lines, which then creates all kinds of opportunities for inconsistencies, inefficiencies, inequities, and to some extent, as you were mentioning, Sanjeev, politically motivated tax expenditure, so the giving of tax exemptions to specific economic actors and so on. And there's also the issue that in some countries, tax expenditures can be created by decree. They don't have to go through the legislative process, which then sort of adds a layer of complexity and of fragmentation. When it comes to the roles that different actors play, one of the key good practice principles is to basically try and keep overall policy coordination concentrated in a single unit, in a single entity, ideally the ministry responsible for overall fiscal policy, Ministry of Finance or whatever other name it may have in different countries. What we found was that in fact, ministries of finance tend to play a fairly limited role when it comes to tax expenditures, and they certainly hardly ever play this overall coordination role that they are supposed to play. They do have a role in terms of vetting proposals, in terms of being part of ad hoc councils and other governance arrangements, but usually as at the same level, if not at sort of at a lower level compared to other actors, which then preempts this coordinating role that they should have. Revenue administrations, of course, play an important role, but the role is mostly sort of overseeing implementation, collecting information, publishing information sometimes. but certainly they usually do not get involved in policy development, policy definition, policy coordination, and so on. The actors that end up playing often an oversized role, especially when it comes to tax incentives for public investment of different kinds, is the line ministries that are involved in setting policy for specific sectors, like, again, economic development or tourism or the extractive sector and other similar ones. And often they end up, if tax expenditures are given for a specific sector, these sector ministries play a role that they shouldn't really play, where they set policy, they decide who should get tax expenditures, they actually monitor the implementation themselves, and sometimes they set up governance arrangements which are sort of parallel to the central government structures, again creating fragmentation and lack of coordination. Parliaments, they play a contradictory role. They approve the legislation where tax expenditures are included if they go through the legislative process. Sometimes they propose tax expenditures themselves, often lobbied by specific vested interests, but they actually play a very limited role in monitoring and making sure that tax expenditures are used in an effective manner. So what we see, again, as I said, is a very fragmented, uncoordinated, ineffective process that leaves a lot of space for the misuse of tax expenditures for different purposes and their lack of effectiveness. In the paper, we provide a number of examples of how this sort of takes place in different countries and in different sectors, from the extractive sector in Argentina and Brazil to tourism in the Dominican Republic, special economic zones in Guatemala and in Guatemala and El Salvador, and so on. So if people are interested, there's more evidence in there. We basically identify 3 areas which we think are fundamental for governments to sort of rethink the way in which they manage tax expenditures going forward. The first one is the issue of coordination. So basically setting up legal, regulatory, but most of all policy frameworks where basically responsibilities are clear, objectives are set out, mechanisms are organized so that the granting, implementing, and monitoring of tax expenditures becomes a sort of whole of government approach that takes into account the different and sometimes contradictory objectives that tax expenditures serve from an overall fiscal policy perspective, and at the same time, the, let's say, the investment promotion objective that many of them have. So basically coordination and setting clear rules for how they should be managed. Second issue is the issue of evidence, where basically there's a need for a lot more evidence to be in the public domain and to be produced and published, both at the appraisal stage and at the performance monitoring stage, so that it is easier for governments and for the public more in general to get a sense of which tax expenditures make sense and how well they're working in terms of the objectives that they're meant to serve. And the third topic, the third issue is the issue of accountability. So it's really setting clear objectives and monitoring performance, having sunset clauses in place that are mandatory for all tax expenditures, which then creates the need for evaluation and review, clearly identifying and possibly publishing information on the beneficiaries of tax expenditures, and finally creating some mechanisms for more inclusion and more dialogue around the need for tax expenditures and how they should be utilized. One of the other issues that we saw was that, basically stakeholders that are important and that may suffer from the implementation of tax expenditures are often not included in the debates, in the discussion. So the issue of broader accountability that goes beyond just sort of some of the key directly involved actors is also very important. So those 3 areas we think are the areas that are really important for governments to take into account. And let me stop there and we can continue afterwards. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Paolo, for very succinct remarks. And let me now turn to Luisa. Luisa, the OECD paper that came out recently covers a broader range of countries compared to the focus of Paolo's study. So what are the principal conclusions that you draw from that study? Are they different from Paolo's study, or what are the key features that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Sanjeev, for this question and also for the invitation to participate in the panel. I think our findings are very well aligned with what Paulo suggested. We cover a broader set of countries, but we cover a smaller set of incentives. We focus on corporate income tax incentives. And I'm happy to present the highlights of the paper. I have prepared some slides because our paper is really a database paper. We are building a database. And so it's a lot of different design features, different data. So I prefer to back this up with a little bit, with some slides. So let me share my screen very briefly. Can you see it? Works, cool. So I should say this is also just one part of a broader work stream, and this is a work stream across the tax and investment department of the OECD, building an investment tax incentives database and building more. The work stream seeks to increase transparency, and so this is what I heard in Paulo's presentation as well: increase transparency on what exists, what is there around the world, to then see where we need to focus to improve regimes, to improve the design of incentives. This is joint work, as I said, with between the tax and investment department. My co-authors Alessandra and Martin, I think they're also on the call. But just to briefly say what we're doing, we compile information on investment tax incentives for focusing on corporate tax here. And we did this in the initial phase for 36 developing countries. What we actually do is we create the data. No? We go to the legal documents in the different countries and we look at how investment incentives apply, what the design features are, what the governance structures are. And we then try to bring structure to the data. So we look at design features, we look at eligibility conditions, and we look at governance features. Why do we do all this work? And I think there I join Paulo. We find that there's no comprehensive information is available, at least not at the level that we need to develop hands-on recommendation. What we see is that the devil really is in the country-specific details. It's very difficult to provide big recommendations, large recommendations. It's really, we have to go and see what the incentive structures are in the country. And I'm glad to present some of the findings. They echo very well what Paulo already mentioned, but it's another set of countries. It's you will see in a second. So first of all, what are the types of tax incentives that we find, where we see? The incentives used are exemptions, reduced rates, allowances, and credits, of course. But what we find is that around 70% of our database entries are tax exemptions and reduced rates. So the income-based incentives that we all know are most likely less effective and more prone to windfall profits for firms. What this graph doesn't show is that that's only a very high level representation, and a lot of information is hidden on the specific design features of these incentives. So what's the length of an exemption? What's the degree of a reduced rate? What's the typical allowance schedule? Is it an enhancement? So there's a lot of specific design features that we have as well in the data, and I invite you to take a look at the paper. I can't present everything here. It's just important to say that I think different stakeholders need to really get their head around all the different features to make sure to understand, as an investor, what am I actually eligible for? And as a government official, what are we actually offering? Because it is very complex. What we also find is that tax incentives hinge upon very complex eligibility conditions. And this graph shows a number of countries. It shows the number of countries that have incentives conditional on a specific eligibility criteria. So you can think of different eligibility conditions, like incentives that are only granted to specific sectors, incentives that are only available in special economic zones, incentives that relate to investor characteristics. For example, an incentive can only be available above a specific investment size, only for listed companies. Many countries, like all countries, have these conditions in place. They overlap very often. You don't only have one condition, but several that overlap, and this makes it very complex, the whole landscape of tax incentives. And while we know that targeting incentives to certain projects, certain activities, certain firms may help either to focus on a specific policy objective or to limit revenue forgone, we also see through our work that it's a very complex landscape. It reduces transparency. Investors may not understand what they're eligible for. Government services may not see through either. And this hinders evaluation, as Paulo already said, it hinders evaluation, it hinders reform. So to achieve better incentive designs, to remove inefficient and wasteful incentives, we really need to have more transparency on what is actually available. And this is only measuring what's available. It doesn't measure take-up, right? This is only what we find in the laws for the moment. Another area that's interesting, maybe to zoom into the sector conditions a bit. What you see here is a bit of a complex graph, but you see all our countries on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, you see the sectors. The ISIC sector categories. And what you see here is that these are incentives that apply with a sector condition. So what we first see here is that most countries that have a sector condition in place don't actually target sectors very narrowly. It's a sector condition, but in the end, all sectors actually are eligible to the incentive. And what we see secondly is that in case that incentives are very specific, for example, here, this example of Cambodia, the incentive is only available to the textile sector. This often happens, of course, for sectors that have a very important high economic importance already. So here we see that the textile sector actually in Cambodia makes up roughly 80% of the exports from manufacturing industries. So either not very specific targets, and if it's targeted, we have targets to specific sectors that are already doing very well actually. So it shows that the sector targeting is not very transparent, and it's also sometimes questionable if the incentive is still justified. Do we still need an incentive in a sector that is already of high economic importance? And finally, to also go very briefly to the governance question that Paulo mentioned. I don't want to go too much into detail because I think the studies are the findings are very well aligned actually. What you see here on the top panel is that many countries, so it's on the horizontal axis, you see the countries scatter the incentives provisions across several laws, as Paulo mentioned. So what we see here is that actually around 40% of countries provide investment tax incentives through one legislative piece. It's often the tax law or the tax code, but all the other countries have several legislative pieces in place to govern tax incentives. So it's similar to what Paulo found in his study. And then the bottom panel shows you again the authorities that are governing the incentives. And also what you see here is also that several authorities are involved in governing investment tax incentives. And very often it's several authorities at the same time. So there are many countries where the responsibilities are shared, and the Ministry of Finance is the sole granting authority only in about a third of the countries that we serve it. So again, similar to what Paulo mentioned, very complex governance features, overlapping responsibilities, and this, as he mentioned already, results in limited transparency and may inhibit accountability. I mean, it's the same dimensions that we find evidence for as well. This reduces the effectiveness probably of the policy strategy and can, of course, increase discretionary behaviors. So the bottom line, I think, is that what we find in the study is incentives designs are multidimensional, very complex, country-specific. Eligibility criteria add another layer of complexity. It inhibits transparency both for investors, to government services, and the general public. And we also know that an effective management of tax incentives, including tax incentive reform, requires transparency. We need to better understand what incentive is available, to whom, what incentive is actually taken up, what are the key objectives associated with incentives, and are they actually met? And our paper shows that in most cases, we are actually far from answering these questions, and these shared responsibilities and several legal references do not really help to solve, I think, the tax incentive reform questions. And I think I leave it there. Please take a look at the study. There's much more in it, just a key highlight.
Thank you, Luisa, very much. we can see the similarities between the two studies. Now I'll turn to Catherine and ask her if the two reports that have just come out, how will that help the IMF's work on rationalizing tax expenditures in the countries where you are having active advisory role? Catherine.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this interesting panel. I think the topic is really timely, as you pointed out, Sanjeev, in your introductory comments, as countries begin to emerge from the crisis and face another one. So, and another one, it's sort of triple whammy for many of the developing countries, and revenue, increased revenue is really, if it was always important, it's of the utmost importance, especially to enable countries to, have, to protect their population and have, support the government spending in the areas that it considers to be critical. So I couldn't think of a more, relevant topic. And I want to thank the colleagues from the OECD and Paolo for your papers. We read them with great interest and found them really interesting. A general comment is that any study and type of research that brings out cross-country comparisons, first of all, on this issue of tax expenditures, and then highlights again what the core challenges are for actually not only the developing countries, there are also emerging market and challenges in the advanced economies on expenditure, estimating tax expenditures. But since we're focusing on the low-income countries, just how useful it is to have other partners be focusing on this issue and bring out some of the difficulties in determining tax expenditures and the issue of transparency and accountability that go to topics that the IMF is very much focusing on now, linked to the governance aspects of economic management, right? This is one topic that goes to the heart of governance, transparency, accountability, as well as the revenue mobilization and the economic impacts of tax expenditures, the potential economic impact. So I would say, Sanjeev, both timely and a welcome confirmation of many of the topics, many of the recommendations that the IMF brings up in our dialogue with member countries. And perhaps I can also share a bit, what do I mean by complementary, and how is the IMF supporting member countries on this topic of tax expenditures? Let me see if my sharing abilities are at all possible. Let me see whether I can find my slides, which don't seem to be coming up for some reason. Let me try one more time. And if they don't, I will just talk through them. For some reason, I don't see my points. But let me talk to a few of the material, the slides that I had presented, Sanjeev. First is our approach to tax expenditure assessment is now formalized in a program that we've called the Tax Expenditure Assessment Program, the TEA program. And it's a structured approach to help countries estimate and use tax expenditures in fiscal management. And it's very much focusing on a structured approach to helping countries both with the methodological and quantitative aspects of estimating their tax expenditures, the institutional aspects, also the legislative aspects that were referred to in both presentations. These approach that the IMF is using are very nicely described in a how-to note that colleagues of mine, headed by Mario Mansour, who heads one of our tax policy division, prepared in 2019. This how-to note was published in 2019, which is pretty much guiding countries on tax expenditure reporting and its use in fiscal management. And here, I just want to highlight a couple of the steps because, you know, that as both of you said, the devil is in the details. So this assessment and the how-to note summarize a bit the layout, the steps in the tax expenditure analysis that of course are scalable depending on the country's capacity, but they consist of the following broadly. Defining a benchmark tax system, preparing an inventory of tax expenditures, collecting data, estimating tax expenditures, and preparing a tax expenditure report. So very much going then to the concrete, to the details of how countries can go about estimating and managing the tax expenditures. And some of the key lessons that come out of in the how-to note, I think are useful. Also coming down one level to looking at what the countries need to focus on. For example, the tax expenditure assessment is not a one-off exercise, but a yearly exercise that offers scope for continuous improvement. So the need to invest in that. A second lesson is that the format and presentation of the document is important. A third is that countries need a well-connected and dedicated team to support the tax expenditure assessment process. For example, a tax policy unit or its equivalent. And we know that this is a challenge in many developing countries where the tax policy units are weak or even non-existent, and very little continuity in terms of tax policy analysis or capacity. And the fourth broad lesson is that tax expenditure reporting is a mechanism to improve the quality of public policy. And here very much echo what OECD and Paolo said, you know, transparency and regular review of individual tax measures being important. So let me just highlight those observations, Sanjeev, and hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, very much. Now, you've set the stage for us to listen to our representatives from countries. I will first turn to Tentley, who, as I said earlier, is head of the tax policy in Madagascar. So the question that comes up is, what are currently the main opportunities and challenges for rationalizing tax expenditures in Madagascar from your perspective? How do you see that?
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. And it is a great opportunity for me to participate to this exciting panel today. I think that before present what are the current opportunities and challenges that we face, I think it is necessary to give you an overview of what is going on in Madagascar. Because it is a very recurrent thematic, as Catherine said just before. And as a developing country, Madagascar needs to safeguard sufficient financial resources to contain the spread of COVID-19 and to get the economy back to a minimum level of a recovery track for public spending. So tax expenditure assessment and rationalization are, I think, a key policy for domestic mobilization revenue. Tax expenditures assessment has been effective in Madagascar since 2015 and elaborated by tax policy unit during the few last years. The tax policy unit is in the Ministry of Finance. And the Malagasy government, through the Ministry of Finance, releases annually an annex to the budget guidelines law, which includes the detailed aggregates of tax expenditures by sector, by incentive tax type, by beneficiary, by objective, and finally a summary of analysis, such as cost-benefit analysis of 2 or 3 identified incentives measures. To give you an idea, tax expenditures currently stand at over 2.8% of GDP. It means like 1/5 of tax GDP ratio of Madagascar. A total of 500 tax incentives, domestics and customs revenue combined, have been initially granted in some social and economic goals to promote business and investment climate. But unfortunately, as you said at the introduction, many of them have been proved to be ineffective and even, as you said, politically motivated. So, as I said, the tax expenditure rationalization becomes a real emergency in terms of domestic revenue mobilization. So, what are the different opportunities given and the challenges that the Malagasy government face for rationalizing tax expenditures? First, the main opportunity is monitoring and following up the granted tax incentives. It may be at the same time an opportunity, but may lead also to big challenges. As I said, it is very recent. Our unit has been initially created in late 2017, first to assess and then to monitor and to elaborate tax expenditures cost-benefit analysis in order to rationalize those which have been proved to be ineffective. It is one way to follow up these measures, to propose also policy changes to authority and all decision makers and all stakeholders. And as I mentioned before, to publish final reports in terms of transparency and accountability, as Paulo and Luisa raised just before. But unfortunately, there is currently no clear mechanism to translate this recommendation into actual policy changes, and most of the taken decision from the government, unfortunately, result from lobbying, external position, or like private sector position, rather than our own analysis. To resolve this concern, we decided to propose to the government a procedural approach by elaborating a draft of a decree on the process from granting to following through implementing the tax incentives and assessing the overall impacts and effectiveness of all these measures. This decree is in preparation and needs the approval of the Ministries' Council. I mean by Ministries' Council, it's a board of all the ministries in the government. They have like a weekly meeting to decide and to discuss some social economic issues. Second, rationalizing tax expenditures allows to administer tax incentives in a transparent manner. And as I said, each year should the government release publicly a statement of tax expenditures. Rationalizing tax policy raises some outstanding concerns, such as distributional impacts on different income groups, impacts of tax incentives on macroeconomic parameters such as growth, productivity, consumption, consumer prices, etc., etc. Nevertheless, we cannot finalize this process of rationalization without one important prerequisite, which constitutes one of the big challenges, if not the biggest, in terms of tax expenditure rationalization. I mean by data availability. The challenge is to overcome limitation in data availability. The first step in rationalization process is to quantify the impact of the tax expenditures. And I can say that we use in Madagascar micro-simulation models which measure revenue forgone under major taxes such as income tax, CIT, payroll tax, VAT, excess tax, and so on and so on. But most of the time, data available data are obsolete. For instance, the most recent available national household survey has been conducted in 2010, which means 12 years ago. But we hope that the latest survey, which have been conducted in 2020, will be available soon. And if available, the data may not, be at the level that we want. I mean, they re-aggregate or not detailed for our models. We have to face also sometimes no cooperation and no transparency from the requested entity. A second point, incentives may have been granted by a variety of government bodies outside the finance ministry without any institutional oversight. I think this point has been raised by the present three speakers. And especially during the pandemic, even until now, many tax incentives, mainly those on imports, are granted by Ministry Council instead of being ratified through the law or the Parliament. We said that the best practice is providing all tax incentives through laws only, and one big step has been done this year in consolidating tax incentives in the law. We initiate this action with the free zone measures. We integrate all the tax and customs measures from the free zone law in the general tax code. We are planning to follow this step with the other sectoral laws like mining code, energy code, etc. Last but not the least, one of the biggest challenge of the processes of rationalizing tax expenditures is to do the best choice of which measure is concerned or not. Developing countries such as Madagascar should on the one hand find the balance between best and competitive public policy, including tax policy, in promoting investment with the objective of exports increase or employment creation and other objectives related to the SDGs goals, but also at the same time improve domestic revenue mobilization, which seems to be contradictory. And on the other hand, realistically, some tax expenditures are not option to eliminate for revenue mobilization because they are very difficult to eliminate in light of social objectives such as like rice. Rice is the basic meal in Madagascar, cereals, dairy items, etc. And even also international agreements, especially in customs. Let me stop here. Maybe I've been a little bit long. We can continue with the question, but thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Dan Tetley. I appreciate your going through Madagascar's experience. That brings me to Dan, and I have similar sort of a question from Dan as well, particularly in light of what's going on in Ghana, because there is a legislation which is pending with the parliament where they are seeking to rationalize tax expenditures. So what are the challenges and opportunities at your end that you see in the case of Ghana?
Right. Thank you, Sanjeev, for the opportunity to speak about this. Straight to the question, I'd still like to give a little bit. Tax incentives, tax expenditures, have three main sources. Either it's legislation directly, or where there's.
Can you come closer to the mic, please?
Okay, sorry.
The sound is not, yeah.
Okay, so where there's, so first is through legislation. Where legislation gives a discretion for a waiver, then it goes back to Parliament for Parliament to pass a resolution supporting. And then there are some agreements which are a bit dated, also host country agreements or other development agreements have been signed over the years. So all these sort of give rise to tax expenditures. What happened during that period, over a period? A lot of these laws were not abided by. Some legislation had other people providing exemptions other than the Ministry of Finance. There were other abuses. There were third parties, third parties. So there were quite a number of things that were happening over the last 2 decades. So starting somewhere around 2006, some attempts were made gradually to bring some sanity into the system. One of the things that was done was to take out income tax exemptions as much as possible, and income tax and corporate tax exemptions as much as possible. Some legislation was passed where the Commissioner General had the right to refuse to grant an exemption if it was not situated in law. Another thing was another law that was passed. Nobody could negotiate expenditures if you have the approval of the Minister of Finance. But still, some of these things with these challenges were still there. A few administrative measures was put in to make sure that monitoring was done. And then in 2016, the Revenue Administration Act came out, and it provided some also legislation. But even with this, we still have some challenges. One of them is still the issue of people not following the law, because there are some few loopholes in it. And there's the general conception that once it's a government project or it's government related, there should be exemptions. And so people they have the mindset that the government project need to get exemptions. So it makes the exemption a bit difficult actually to manage. The other challenge that really came up, and I just mentioned it, are some of the agreements which are a bit outdated. And so they have provisions in them which you are being asked to keep and maintain when really they don't make sense. And so that was the other one. And the monitoring of the exemptions was another issue. For customs-related exemptions, import-related exemptions, it wasn't too difficult to measure because customs has always had an automated system. So whatever you put in, you can easily. So since 2006, we've actually been reporting on import exemptions, the Ghanaian budget. Our PFM Act requires that the minister now provides a statement of tax expenditures for the previous year and estimates for the next year as an attachment to the budget. The Revenue Administration Act requires that the reporting is also done. So with these, the opportunity then came for us to start doing some more measurements. So the GRA, for example, domestic tax division, and other exemptions. We started a project in 2011 where we measured exemptions or domestic related exemptions from 2007 through to 2011. And subsequently, every year we do the reports. The only thing that we haven't done is that because it's more of a sample, using more for internal use than publishing. We actually planned that with the 2022 budget, start publishing. So we started a job to collect data to do that. Unfortunately, once COVID came in, and a lot of the data was manual, sort of had to hold on. We've just started. Expect that in the next 2 years, we should publish these things. We should be able to have a repository of all exemptions which can be made public, published for everybody. And that moves me to the exemptions bill which we have in public. The idea is that the exemptions, tax expenditure provisions, were in various legislation. It wasn't centralized. And so income tax was income tax act, that VAT exemptions in the VAT Act, that excise duty exemption in the excise duty act, we had customs and all these agreements. And were exemptions given for all manner of things, fees and charges, which were people's expenses, third-party payments, which had nothing to do with government. And so the exemptions.
Dan, you may want to come a little bit closer to the mic for clarity. Yeah.
Is it clearer now? Sorry.
Yeah.
Is it better? Is it better now?
All yes.
Right. Okay. So then the question then came as to what does the exemption bill do? It does three main things. Provide clear criteria for providing tax expenditures. It also provides for monitoring and evaluation. And it provides some prohibitions that no tax exemption should be granted, which is not in the Tax Exemptions Act, as apart from those which are already incorporated in the Income Tax Act, the Value Added Tax Act, the Excise Duty Act. We had very clear provisions. And so that's what the bill does. What it also does, and again, it incorporates and this is really, the 2015 Addis meeting in Addis came out with a resolution which was passed by the UN finally, unanimously, where there was this commitment to not request for exemptions with no ODA assistance. And aside of that, also the UN Committee of Experts have also these guidelines. So with these guidelines, we expect that it will help us also to look at those agreements which provide exemptions which really will help.
Dan, do you think you can finish in 1 minute? Because then...
Yes, I'm at the end of almost.
Yeah, thank you.
So with that, those are, as I said, the opportunities that it grants. So the opportunities based on the law, and then these commitments from the Addis initiative to sort of resolve the exemptions and tax expenditure issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Augustine, I'll turn to you. You're the last panelist, but you have produced one of the major reports on tax expenditures. And you've been working on this issue for some years, and you've done a great job. So how do you think that two recent reports would further advance the reform agenda in this area?
Thank you, Sanjay. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Yes, the report that you mentioned is the flagship report discussing the main findings of the Global Tax Expenditures Database, what we call the GTED, which is a project that Christian von Handemann from the German Development Institute, my CP colleague, Florim Aliou, and I have been working on for the last years, and was launched in June 2021. So basically, very quickly, the GTED provides all available official and publicly available information on tax expenditures published by governments worldwide since 1990. We basically gather the data from official tax expenditure reports as the ones mentioned by Catherine before. So while working on the GTED, we identified many barriers to advance the reform of tax expenditure systems, lack of capacity and resources, particularly in developing countries, obviously, as well as lack of data are often mentioned as the main ones. Yet, I strongly believe that the lack of political will and governance issues discussed, such as the ones discussed during today's event, are as important, if not more, than resources, capacity, and data. To a large extent, my engagement in the tax expenditure field was triggered by the striking lack of transparency in Switzerland, the country where I live and where CP is based. To make a long story short, by then, when we started working on this project, the Swiss federal government had only released one tax expenditure report in 2011, And that report was based up to a large extent on 2005 data for the canton of Bern or province of Bern that was then extrapolated to the rest of the country. So even when this opacity is a clear breach to the Swiss law and after some explicit requests from different members of the parliament, the situation remains unchanged today. There has not been another report published in Switzerland after the 2011 one. This echoes what Catherine mentioned before, that the lack of data and transparency is not only an issue in poor countries, but also can be an issue in emerging and even advanced economies. So I like this example of Switzerland because it illustrates a case where the lack of capacity and resources cannot be the main reason behind such a bleak scenario when it comes to transparency, right? I think that both studies today, presented today here, do a very good job in bringing to the table issues that are often neglected or underestimated when it comes to their relevance as barriers to advanced reform processes. Just let me very briefly comment on them. The one by IBP that Paulo nicely presented provides a clear description of how in a region like Latin America, where all countries have quite of a tradition when it comes to reporting on tax expenditures, still governance can be hindering the transparency needed to advance reform. So most of the reports, tax expenditure reports in Latin America can and should be improved. That's what we observe in the GTED, but at least most of Latin American economies do provide some tax expenditure data. It's a region particularly good at that. But again, the IBP study shows that that's not enough. Governance is crucial, and if governance is not solved and managed properly, reforms cannot be moved forward. So our engagement in the tax expenditure area is based on a comprehensive three-stage approach. We believe that providing good quality data on tax expenditures, again, coming back to tax expenditure reports as discussed by Catherine and in our GTED project, including not only revenue foregone estimates at the individual tax expenditure provision level, but also information regarding beneficiaries, policy goals, and other design features, is necessary first step to carry out more and better evaluations. That's the second stage, evaluations, that should ultimately be used as the main input for reform processes, being that one the third stage. So, as discussed in the IBP study, governance is a key element throughout the whole process, we think, but particularly when it comes to the later stage about reforming tax expenditures. And the OECD report that was presented by Luisa focuses on another key aspect that is often neglected, which I really appreciated while reading it: design features of tax expenditures. As she said, design features can add a layer of complexity to the tax expenditure discussion. I personally have quite a critique view of tax expenditures in general and of tax incentives for investment in particular. But I always try to be clear, tax expenditures are not bad per se, right? What happens is that very often, and for different reasons, they happen to be ill-designed and end up being ineffective and triggering negative externalities. So just to finish here, I'm currently working on a policy brief on tax expenditures and their impact on women labor force participation for the T20, the engagement group for the G20, where one of the key messages of my colleagues and myself is, if governments decide to implement tax incentives to boost women labor participation, design features can be crucial and must be considered, for instance, to mitigate their regressive impact. Deductions are often more regressive than tax credits, for instance, and refundability, making tax credits fully refundable, is another crucial feature, since it allows to target the worse off, such as low-income individuals, those earning below tax-free thresholds, and even informal workers. So this type of design features that are often not part of the discussion or only within very technical targeted groups of stakeholders should be much more debated and made aware in the debate when it comes to tax expenditures. So I will stop here for the sake of time. Sanjay, thanks.
Thank you, Agustin. For the next round, I would like to pose two questions for the panel. And one are directed to the country representatives, other at the people who are looking at the broader set of issues. And anyone can answer the question, but you'll have to answer within a minute or two so that we have time to go over, to finish this discussion in time. So the question that comes to my mind, and it's also something that some people are asking in the audience, is, are there any countries that have successfully reformed tax expenditures? Do we know of some successful tax expenditure experiences that we can cite and say, look, here is the case? Or are we saying that this is a very hard nut to crack, and that this requires a whole lot of political push? So that's a question for any one of you, whoever wants to answer. I will let you respond to that. Catherine.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. Really interesting, everybody's comments. Tanteli, Dan, Agustin, thank you. Look, I think that in my experience, there's been one country that has reformed part of its VAT exemptions, and that's Uganda. Very interestingly, IMF helped the Ugandan Revenue Administration and Ministry of Finance estimate one of the first VAT gaps. That is, what is the compliance gap in the country? And that was broken down by sectors. And it became quite evident that some sectors were contributing a lot more than others to both the policy gap and the compliance gap. And as a result of that study and that information, the government took a decision to reduce some of the VAT exemptions. And the revenue impact was quite important for the government, and in fact allowed it to, exceed what had been sort of a 12 to 13 point of GDP tax to GDP ratio for many years. I think that played a role in allowing the government to exceed that. So I would cite that Uganda's experience as important. And the second thing I want to mention on exemptions, it's not only reforming them, but also administering them effectively. And here I want to cite the example of Argentina, where the AFIP the tax administration set up a group focused exclusively on making sure that those that were eligible for the exemptions were actually the ones that were benefiting from them. And lo and behold, from a very, relatively simple exercise, they found that there were others that were claiming the benefit from those exemptions. So it's not really a policy reform, but an administrative focus on improving, adherence to the tax expenditure legislation that also had some important results in terms of improved compliance. Thanks, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Catherine. The situation is not all that pessimistic, so one can say that reform is feasible. Paulo, from your experience, would you like to add something?
Thanks. I'm going to mention a couple of examples. One from the countries we've looked at, and one more general one. The more general one is about the Philippines, and I think also Agustin and others can speak to this, where a few years ago they went through a very comprehensive review of their tax policy, and they sort of undertook a series of reforms in a number of areas of tax policy, and one of them was clearly focused on tax expenditures. And if I remember correctly, and again, I don't have all the details, they basically did a major rationalization of mostly of corporate tax incentives linked to a reduction of the corporate income tax rate. So it was kind of a quid pro quo with business that allowed them to basically clean up a lot of the the sort of the what's it called, the very prolific giving away of tax expenditures to businesses in the previous years, and to sort of start afresh with a new system. The second example, which I think is interesting to mention, is not necessarily the case of reform, but what we saw in Peru was that the regulatory framework for tax expenditures has some interesting characteristics that allow for a more continuous review of what goes on with tax expenditures. The law says that basically tax expenditures cannot have an automatic sunset clause of 3 years, which then forces government and parliament to, at a regular interval, to sort of think about what is going on with tax expenditures. And although in the past, what was mostly happening was almost like an automatic renewal without a lot of discussion, in more recent years, there has been a little bit more public debate and a little bit more of interest in actually looking at the effectiveness of some tax expenditures and questioning their objectives before they're given the green light to continue. So it's not necessarily a comprehensive reform exercise, but it's really some characteristics of the ways in which the framework is set up that allows for that continuous review to take place and for the benefits of that to show up over time.
Thank you, Paolo. But the question that arises in case of Peru is whether their tax to GDP ratio improved as a result of this policy change.
I would have to go back and look at the data to sort of look at that. And as I said, this, we, from our partners' perspective in Peru, we saw evidence of at least more debate happening. That doesn't mean, as I said, that this was a comprehensive reform taking place, but some, interesting signals that things can improve.
Thank you. Luisa, would you like to add anything to this?
I think just a quick remark is that while we are compiling this database, what we see is that there doesn't need to be necessarily a big comprehensive reform. I agree that, a big reform of tax expenditures would be the first best case, but seeing countries, and I see, we see this while checking the data, we see that there's already a reform in place. Having small steps and making small adjustments to the incentives is something that we should also highlight and see as a step into the right direction. Of course, bigger reform is important, but also politically more challenging. That's maybe I want to add that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're on mute, Sanjeev.
Sorry.
You're muted.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Augustine, I'll come to you. You are really the father of some of this work on tax expenditures. So what is your view? You've been looking at data. So do you have any other cases that come to your mind where there has been successful tax expenditure reform?
Yes, I think Mexico also did quite a good job a few years ago, cleaning up the tax incentives, particularly, if I'm not mistaken, definitely on income-related expenditures, particularly on business-related corporate income taxes. But I wanted to echo what Luisa just said before. I understand that here we are talking about tax expenditure reform as a benchmark or as the north, and we sometimes think that this needs to be done in one step in a comprehensive package. And I totally agree. There are a few examples out there on how challenging that could be from a political perspective. Colombia recently, last year, that's a case in point. And I think that's why evaluation is crucial. And that's what we learned by working throughout the GTED. Data is not the goal per se. Data needs to be the input for evaluations. And when we talk about evaluations, really trying to identify those tax expenditures that make sense and those that are not cost effective and should be reformed. And then that reform can really be provision by provision, right? And again, if a government wants to do this in a package and with a broader perspective and pull in a few tax expenditures, that's all good. But I think it's really crucial to understand which, and I think Tanteri mentioned that, there are some tax expenditures that just cannot be eliminated, right? For many reasons, for social impact, for many reasons. So evaluation is crucial. We need to understand which tax expenditure provisions are value for money and which tax expenditure provisions do not make sense because of their cost, because of their ineffectiveness, or because of the side effects they trigger. And that's what policy makers should try to do. And then, yes, reform tax expenditure systems, either gradually or as a comprehensive package.
And Tetley, I was going to ask the next question to you. You can answer both. The question that I'm going to pose to you and Dan, and also the one and your contribution to the question that I raised to the other people. You've heard all kinds of suggestions being advanced by the reports on tax expenditures. You also heard the response on basically following an incremental approach to reforming tax expenditures. Do you agree with that, or do you think there is something else that one needs to do?
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Just what Augustine told just before, it is really true that it is crucial. The step of evaluation is crucial because it's the first step as far as I'm concerned, is the first step to choose which measure should be rationalized. And that's a really big issue in, I think, in many countries. And first to evaluate, but then, you know, to help political, you know, political view to be aware of the importance of the tax expenditures too. And it is not easy. In Madagascar, as maybe it is Paulo who raised that point. In Madagascar too, there is, like, you know, as I said, there are many lobbying, you know, to implement some tax measures, and sometimes it is through the parliament, and it seems to be contradictory, and it's why the political will is very important too. To have you
apologies for for interrupting you, but you know, we have left with only 4 minutes. So if you can speak for 1 minute, then I'll go to Dan, and then I'll take the remaining 2 minutes to summarize.
Yeah, sorry, I'm very talkative. Okay, so to answer your second question, I think it's I agree to do an incremental, you know, step to rationalize tax expenditures from not maybe eliminate, but, like, you know, doing it gradually. There are some countries which have done that kind of rationalization, but I totally agree with you to do like you know, gradually a step to do the rationalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Tantele, for sticking to the time limit. Dan, would you like to step in, please?
Okay, sorry, my video has gone off, but at least I can talk. You can hear me?
You're on mute, Benji. You're on mute.
Yes, Daniel, we can hear you.
Okay,
So
right.
we can hear you, but and your sound is much better.
Okay, all right. Thank you. And I believe that the incremental approach is very essential and very good. In Ghana, we've been able to have some success because we adopted that incremental approach. Basically, for now, for most agreements, we've been able to take out corporate taxes. So you won't find any discretionary corporate tax exemptions. We've done some level of rationalization. A lot of the fees and charges, third-party charges, we've been able to take them out of providing those expenditures. And it's been easier to do because we are doing it gradually, we've been able to make some process. We have decided to do a big bang approach. I'm sure we would have had a lot of anarchy on our hands. So the incremental approach helps. It helps you to measure as you go along and to make that progress that you need to make. And we expect to do a bigger approach with the exemptions bill. That is a bit larger. But then the little increments have helped to get us that far.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. This time your sound was really, really very clear. I think the picture was somehow distorting the sound. So thank you. And so let me, we have come almost to the end. We have 1 or 2 minutes left. I think we had a very good discussion. There are some interesting conclusions that fall out of this discussion. And I mean, what comes out is that the problem is arising with tax expenditures because in many places, ministers of finance don't really control them fully. They are, sort of spread out in different parts of the government. And of course, they have not been able to consolidate all this information in one unit, tax policy unit in some parts in some countries. And then the problem has also arisen because countries don't necessarily follow the legislative process to grant these expenditures. So it's clearly an issue of transparency and governance. And of course, we didn't really discuss the benefit incidents, which can raise a whole lot of issues about tax expenditures, who is really benefiting from them, and the impact of these tax expenditures on income distribution and how things are happening in the countries. So I think it is heartening to know that there are some examples where tax expenditures have been reformed or on an incremental basis gradually, and that has led to an increase in tax to GDP ratio. We know in Uganda it did increase the tax to GDP ratio in the last few years. And I think as long as countries keep moving in that direction, there is hope. It also means that all the players who are here today have to continue making the noise that is necessary for a policy change. With this, I will conclude. Thank you so much for participating, and we really thank you for your contributions. And with this, I'll conclude the seminar.
Thank
Bye.
you all. Thank you, Sanjay.